Salam and peace be upon you. My name is Mohammed Layiq Sediqi, the father of Holophase. Remember the language we are learning together. There is one field called phi, spelled Phi. Phi is the holophase, a cyclic rhythm defined at every point in the universe. Its first derivatives give us three simultaneous echoes: time, which we call omega, spelled Omega, space, which we call k, and motion, which we call v, built from both omega and k. Above them, higher derivatives form a branching tree that, in principle, goes on forever. Every law of nature is a pattern in this tree of derivatives of phi. Today, we are going to zoom right into the core of that tree and look at something that sounds familiar, but is much stranger and more beautiful than we usually realize: the unity of time, space, and motion. Welcome to part 10 of episode 6. In the earlier parts, you have met phi as the silent root of reality. You have seen the master tree in your imagination. Phi at the bottom, its first derivatives branching out, then layers of higher and higher nuance stretching towards infinity. In part 9, we explored the philosophy of a phi-closed universe, where everything that exists is just patterns in this single field. Now we take a step that changes how you feel the world. We are going to understand how time, space, and motion are not three separate ingredients added to reality, but three faces of one underlying behavior of phi, like three reflections of the same object in different mirrors. Let us begin with a simple picture. Imagine a choir of three voices singing one melody. One voice is low, one is in the middle, one is high. If you focus only on the low voice, you might think that is the entire song. If you isolate the middle voice, you get a slightly different character. If you listen to the high voice, you hear yet another version. But if you step back and listen carefully, you realize they are all singing the same line, just in different registers. There is one melody, three voices. That is how we are going to think about time, space, and motion. Three voices of one song sung by phi. In the language of phi, time appears as omega, space appears as k, and motion appears as v. We are going to unpack these slowly, so that even without seeing any symbols, you can feel what they mean. Phi itself is the basic phase field. At every point in the universe, phi tells you where you are on a circle. Imagine a tiny clock hand attached to every event in reality, pointing somewhere around the full circle. That angle is phi. But as we learned before, the absolute direction of that hand does not matter. You could rotate every clock hand in the whole universe by the same amount, and nothing observable would change. This is called shift symmetry. What matters is not where the hand points in absolute terms, but how it moves and how its direction differs from place to place. Those changes and those differences are what we call derivatives. The first derivative of phi with respect to time is what we call omega. When you hear omega, think local ticking rate. Stand at one point and watch the tiny phi clock hand at that point. How quickly does it spin as time passes? That rate is omega. If we were writing this in a formula, we would say omega equals the time derivative of phi. That means you take phi now, you take phi a tiny moment later, you subtract them, and you divide by that tiny time interval. For an audio listener, it is enough to remember that omega is how much phi changes per unit time at a given place. It is the raw beat of the local rhythm. The first derivative of phi with respect to space is what we call k. When you hear k, think spatial pattern or spatial fingerprint. Imagine walking in a straight line and watching the phi hand at each point along your path. If the hand rotates a lot as you move a short distance, the pattern is tightly packed. That means k is large. If the hand barely changes as you walk, the pattern is broad and smooth. That means k is small. Mathematically, k is the spatial gradient of phi, the rate at which phi changes with position. You do not need the formal symbol. What matters is the feeling. K tells you how quickly the phase shifts from place to place, how wiggly or smooth the pattern is in space. Now comes the surprising part. Motion, which we usually treat as something separate, like objects flying around inside a fixed stage, is not a separate ingredient here. Motion is built directly out of omega and k. The quantity we call v, the phase velocity, tells you how fast the pattern in phi moves. A simple way to say this is v is the speed and direction you would have to move with so that the phase of the pattern you are following does not change. Imagine painting a dot on a wave crest and asking, how fast do I have to move so that I stay on that dot? The answer is v. If we wanted to say it in an equation, we might say that v equals omega divided by the squared magnitude of k multiplied by the vector k itself. In words, you look at how fast phi is changing in time, that is omega. You compare it to how sharply it changes in space, that is the size of k. And that ratio, pointing along the direction of k, gives you the velocity of a moving phase feature. But for our audio journey, you can hold on to a simple interpretation. Motion v is how phi slides its own patterns across itself so that they stay recognizable over time. Turn this into a concrete picture. Imagine you are a surfer on the ocean. The surface of the water is rising and falling in waves. If you sit still on your board, crests pass underneath you. You feel yourself going up and down as each crest arrives, peaks, and leaves. The number of crests that pass you per second is like omega, your local ticking rate of wave encounters. Now freeze the scene at an instant and look at the distance between crests. If they are close together, the spatial pattern is tight. That corresponds to a large K. If they are far apart, the pattern is gentle. That corresponds to a small k. Finally, if you want to ride the crest, you must paddle and adjust your board so that you move with a particular speed and direction. That special speed is v. It is chosen so that the crest does not move past you. You stay under the same phase of the wave. In the water, those three quantities are linked. You cannot independently choose how often crests hit you, how far apart they are, and how fast they travel. If the wave pattern and the water stay the same, then knowing any two of these determines the third. That is the triunity, already visible at the level of simple waves. Omega tells you how fast the pattern cycles at a point, K tells you how tightly the pattern is packed in space, and V tells you how fast the pattern moves. There are three ways of describing one and the same phenomenon. Now, in the language of phi, there is a compact way to describe the combined change in phi when you move both in time and in space. This combined change is called d phi. Spoken in words, you can think of d phi as the tiny change in phi when you nudge the world a little bit in time and a little bit in space. On paper, you might write d phi equals omega times a tiny step in time minus k multiplied by a tiny step in space. That phrase, minus k times a tiny step in space, simply means that if you move in the direction of k, phi changes at a rate controlled by k. The minus sign is just a convention that fixes which direction we call positive. This expression for d phi compresses the triunity into one line. It says that every tiny move you can make in spacetime has two pieces. A time part, where phi changes because time is passing, and a space part, where phi changes because you are walking through its pattern. If you move purely in time, keeping your position fixed, d phi is just omega times that tiny time step. If you move purely in space, at one instant, d phi is just the contribution from k. But if you move in a clever way, you can make those two pieces cancel. You can choose your movement in space so that the change from time and the change from space exactly balance, leaving d phi equal to 0. That is what it means to write a phase pattern. The velocity that achieves this balance is v. In other words, v is not some mysterious extra vector given to you by a separate law. It is the special direction in which you can move so that d phi stays constant. When you move with velocity v, the combination omega times your time step minus k times your space step stays fixed. You sit on the same phase value. You travel along with the wave. This picture is critical because it shows you, in a very direct way, how time, space, and motion are entangled in one relationship. Now let us overlay this on the master tree in your mind. At the bottom is phi, the quiet root, the field of phase. On the first level up, 3 branches emerge. One branch is labeled omega, the time echo. One branch is labeled k, the space echo. A third branch is labeled v, the motion echo. And you can imagine lines emerging from both omega and k feeding into v. When we highlight this triad and fade everything else away, we see the trunk structure of our language. Everything that comes later in the tree, all the higher derivatives and topological structures and energy expressions, sits on top of this triunity. Let us walk through 3 perspectives on the same simple scene to see how these 3 voices sing together. Imagine a luminous ripple pattern moving across a dark lake at night. First, you are standing on a dock, not moving. Your experience is entirely in time. You look down and watch bright wave crests slide under your feet. You notice how many crests pass per second. If they are fast, you feel a quick flickering rhythm. If they are slow, the lake feels lazy and calm. That is the perspective of omega. Time, from this point of view, is the counting of repeating changes at your location. Second, freeze the whole scene in your imagination at one instant. Pretend time has paused. You can now only look at space. You see the spacing between the bright lines of the crests. Where they are close together, the pattern is sharp, almost like tiger stripes. Where they are far apart, the pattern is broad and soft. That spacing is the perspective of K. Space, from this vantage, is the arrangement and frequency of pattern across the surface. Third, resume time and decide to track one particular crest as it glides away from you. Now your attention lives in motion. You follow that crest, noticing how many meters per second it travels. That speed is the perspective of v. Motion, from this viewpoint, is the path and rate at which a recognizable feature of the field flows. These 3 are not 3 different realities. They are 3 cuts through one phenomenon. If you know the spacing and how quickly crests pass you, you can figure out how fast they travel. If you know how fast they travel and how tightly packed they are, you can infer how often they hit. The triunity is the recognition that the answers to how fast does it happen, how tightly is it arranged, and how fast does it move are bound together by the way phi behaves. Now lift this picture up from a lake to the entire universe. The holophase field phi plays the role of the medium, but it is everywhere, not just on a surface. Every regular rhythm in the world is a pattern in phi. The tick of an atomic clock, the vibration of a violin string, the oscillation of light in a laser, the rotation of a planet, the orbit of a binary star. All of them are different dances of phi. For each such dance, there is an omega field, describing how quickly the local phase cycles in time. There is a K field, describing how the phase changes across space. There is a V field, describing how wave crests or pattern features move. The holophase claim is that what we call time, what we call space, and what we call motion are the large-scale echoes of those 3 fields. Time is not a separate container. It is the collective meaning of all the local omegas. Space is not a blank stage. It is the global shape defined by all decays. Motion is not an extra ingredient glued onto objects. It is the visible effect of all the V patterns. When you ask, how long did that take? You are interrogating omega. When you ask, how far is that? You are interrogating K. When you ask, how fast is it moving? You are interrogating V. You are always talking to phi, just using different questions. Let us return to the rug weaving analogy and stretch it into moving time. Imagine a weaver building a long rug row by row. One way to look at the process is to watch the tempo of their hands, how many knots they tie per minute. That rhythm is like omega. Another way is to look at the finished rug and count how many patterns, how many small diamonds or flowers fit into 1 meter. That density is like K. A third way is to focus on one motif, a little flower shape, and watch how it appears to move along the rug as more rows are woven. It looks as if the motif slides forward, even though the threads themselves do not travel. That apparent motion is like V. In reality, these are three perspectives on one act, the act of weaving thread into pattern. Changing the tempo changes how quickly motifs appear. Changing the pattern density changes how those motifs look and how fast they seem to sweep across the surface. The triunity is one act, three experiences. The expression d phi captures this in a tight way. Remember, d phi tells you how phi changes when you move a little bit in both time and space. If you only move in time, keeping your position still, d phi is just omega times the time step. If you only move in space at a fixed instant, d phi is just the contribution from k multiplied by your spatial step. But when you choose a path where these two effects balance, you are moving with a specific v. Light does this. A light wave follows paths where the phase structure is preserved in a particular way. Many natural motions in physics are paths along which d phi stays constant. That is the deep connection between motion and the structure of time and space encoded in phi. This is where the link to relativity peeks through. In Einstein's relativity, there is a space-time with a metric, a rule for measuring intervals. And light travels along special paths called null geodesics, where the space-time interval is zero. In the phi story, we do something similar but speak in phase language. Instead of saying the interval is zero, we say the phase remains the same, or the combination in d phi behaves in a particular way along the path. Motion is not a separate bolt-on to space-time. It is the way phi adjusts its patterns so that certain paths preserve specific phase relationships. All of this might sound abstract, but it touches your daily experience constantly. When time feels as if it is flying, what you are typically noticing is a dense sequence of changes, many events, many internal updates. In phi language, you are immersed in a high omega environment. When you feel lost in space, standing in a new city with unfamiliar streets, you are struggling to learn the K pattern, to memorize how locations relate to each other in a coherent map. When you are thrilled by speed, sitting in a train that suddenly accelerates, your senses are filled with large V, large velocities, patterns around you changing quickly as you move through them. You might never have named omega, K, or V before, but your whole nervous system is built to read them. Your ears detect oscillations in air pressure, which are literally omega and K patterns of sound waves. Your eyes detect oscillations in electromagnetic fields, light waves, again reading omega and K. Your vestibular system in your inner ear measures acceleration, which is how V changes. Your muscles constantly update their sense of motion and position. Your whole felt sense of I exist in time and space and I am moving is your biology talking to the triunity. Once you see this, the world starts to feel less fragmented. Instead of thinking time is over here, space is over there, motion is something else, you can sense them as three different ways of tasting the same soup. When you look at a clock, you're sampling omega. When you look around the geometry, you're sampling k. When you feel yourself being carried on a bicycle or a bus, you're sampling v. All of them are aspects of one process, the way phi differs and changes. There is also a subtle emotional gift hidden here. In the usual picture, time can feel like an enemy, always running out. Space can feel like a cage. I'm stuck here, not there. Motion can feel like effort, dragging this body around. In the Triunity picture, these are not three independent forces pressing on you. There are three perspectives on one flowing field of change that you are already part of. You are not separate from the river of time, stuck inside a rigid space, forced to move against your will. You are a pattern in phi, shaped by the same dance that shapes galaxies and waves and light. Time, space, and motion are simply the ways that pattern appears from the inside. Before we close this part, let us replay the Triunity through a few final metaphors to make it as intuitive as breathing. Imagine three people clapping out a pattern. The first stands still and claps a regular rhythm. This is the time view, omega. The second arranges markers on the floor in a repeating pattern and claps while stepping from one marker to the next. This is the space view, K. The third walks diagonally across the room, timing their steps so that each clap lines up with a specific place on the floor. This is the motion view, V. If you only watch one of them, you see one aspect. If you watch all three at once, you realize they're enacting the same rhythm in three ways. That is phi acting through omega, k, and v. Think again of a spinning vinyl record under a needle. The bumps in the groove are the spatial pattern, k, written into the plastic. The rotation speed of the record is the temporal cadence, omega. The way a particular bump moves under the needle is the motion, v. Change the spin speed, and the whole song plays faster or slower. Change the groove spacing, and the song's pitch and texture change. Change both, and you radically alter the music. But in every case, what you are experiencing as sound is the triunity made audible. Or imagine a spiral galaxy slowly turning in space. On the surface level, you can say stars move in orbits, gas clouds swirl, light streams out. At the deeper level, in phi language, you say, here is an immense phase pattern, with omegas describing internal cycles, ks describing spatial variation, and vs describing the drift of features like spiral arms. What you normally call cosmic time, cosmic space, and cosmic motion are the large-scale triunity written in the sky. Even your inner life carries a shadow of this structure. When you feel the passage of time inside you, noticing that a day feels long or short, you are tuning in to internal versions of omega, the rates of change inside your brain and body. When you picture the layout of your room with your eyes closed, reconstructing where objects are, you are reconstructing an internal K, a map of relational structure built from experience. When you imagine yourself walking across that room, anticipating how your body will move, you are playing with an inner V, an internal motion pattern. We are not yet claiming these are literally phi derivatives in a neuroscientific sense, but the analogy is strong. The triunity repeats across levels of description, from the physics of fields up through the phenomenology of experience. As we end this part, return once more, in imagination, to the master tree. See phi at the root, glowing softly. Watch three main branches growing from it. omega, the time echo, k, the space echo, and v, the motion echo built from both. Let all the higher branches fade into mist for a moment. Just sit with those three. This is the simplest, clearest picture of the triunity: time, space, and motion as three first words of one language. In the next parts, we will leave this wide philosophical view and start learning the alphabet letters of the language in detail. We will spend a whole part with phi itself as the silent root. We will dive into omega as the pulse of time, into k as the weave of space, into the combined change d phi as the unified letter, and into v as the motion of phase patterns. But everything that follows rests on what you have just felt. That when you ask about time, about space, or about motion, you are talking to the same underlying field. For now, you can carry a very simple intuition with you. The next time you check a clock, remember that you are listening to one voice of the triunity. The next time you notice the shape of a room or the pattern of streets, remember that you are seeing another voice. The next time you feel wind in your face as you move, remember that you are experiencing the third voice. Behind all three is phi, the holophase, humming away at every point in the universe. Time, space, and motion are three ways of hearing that hum.